Normally, in teaching Old Testament, I just do it consecutively all the way through, leaping to the pieces I feel are important. But since we have 25 classes already online, I didn't feel the need to teach those all again. So I taught the first 4, and you can probably recognize why, to get that basic language of temple and the symbolism and all of that beautiful stuff, and the Hebrew words involved, and the names for God, and the timeline. All that stuff is in the first 4 classes, both years. Now we're going to leap over class 5, 6, and 7 from 2022. So everything about Enoch and Noah, and a man had 2 sons and 2 different ways, which I find really an interesting concept and theme running through Scripture. And so you'll want to go back and watch those if you haven't done that previously, because today's class starts at Genesis chapter 10, which is after the story of Noah. And there are some books that I can recommend if you want to learn more about those 3 chapters. This is Jeffrey Bradshaw. I don't have any idea how he has the time to write these books, but they're available at the BYU library and probably Provo Library. I don't know if your local library carries them, but could get them on interlibrary loan. You can also probably find them on Kindle, but I doubt that you're going to find hard copies anymore, because he just did 1 printing. It's possible, but they'll cost you an arm and a leg. So this is ancient and modern perspectives on the book of Moses, which means Genesis chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, right? All of that is in the book of Moses, but with way more information. And his books are just packed with interesting information and connections and charts and pictures. Then he continues the story in volume 2, which is Enoch, Noah, and the Tower of Babel. So that finishes up what we've finished up in class. But there's also this one that is focusing just on the temple themes in the book of Moses. So if you want to do something smaller than those 6 inches, you might start with temple themes and really interesting stuff. His presentations, videos of him presenting this kind of information is available on the Interpreter Foundation website. He gives away everything free there. Now, we're going to talk about maps today. And this is my favorite book of Holy Land maps, the Bible lands. This was published back in the 1980s. And this is the book that the pictures in your picture section at the end of your Bible, this is where they got the pictures from. But it has hundreds. Almost every place in the Holy Land, there's a photograph in this book. It also has satellite maps, which are absolutely accurate, and road maps, for those of you who like maps. You can pick them up at the DI almost every time I go. There's one for about $1 or $2.
What's it called again?
It's called Bible Lands. Photographs, maps, and commentary, and I got mine from Church Distribution back in the 80s, and have bought about 20 copies at the DI to give away. So that gets us to where we start class today. Okay, we have no microphone, so if you can't hear me, you'll have to just move closer. And we're going to start, well, let's see if it wants to move. Oh, the first one is simply introducing it. Abram, because he's not Abraham until the end of class today. It's not until chapter 17 that his name is changed. And Abram means exalted father, and that's his name. So at the end of Genesis 10, you see the division of the world among the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It lists the 70 nations of the world. Some of those, and by nation, they really mean tribe. Okay, and I realized I forgot to start this. No, it's going good. Many of the nations listed there, we have no idea who they are. But the ones that we can identify fit on this map. And I hope you see how big the whole world is. This is the entire biblical world at the time of Abraham. This is everything they know of. So it's divided among Shem and Ham and Japheth. And you'll notice that Ham gets Egypt and North Africa. Those are all of the tribal units that are in his domain. Japheth gets the Caucasus and southern Europe, all the way over to Tarshish, which some believe is Spain. Others will argue it's Italy. But southern Europe is Japheth. And then Shem, from whom come all the Semites, right? That's his name, Semite. That's Shem. His descendants will be in the Middle East, as far east as what we now call Iran. It doesn't really go into India and Pakistan, but almost. And so these are the 70 nations of the world. And 70 has the symbolic meaning of being like 7. We talked about 7, Sheva, Shabbat, all completed, finished. 70 is that same idea on a larger scale, and so 70 means all the nations of the world. But I hope you notice that the entire world is like within 200, 300 miles of the Mediterranean. And so you need to focus in on what would be called the Fertile Crescent as we read these stories. Now, this, I think, is interesting, the tradition of having 70 nations in the world. So when Jesus is asked, how often should I forgive? He says 70 times 7, which interpreted in a Jewish context, in a Hebrew context, means everybody all the time. It doesn't mean you have to forgive your spouse 490 times and you keep track, right? Okay. Now, let's see if this is going to want to move. Yes, good. So we then come after the flood to the building of the Tower of Babel. And the Tower of Babel, to me, is a very interesting story. Of course, it's meant to give an etymological or explanation of the name of the country of Babylon, where people babble, okay? And this is where Babelfish comes from, right? That program where you're learning all these different languages. I don't know if you know, but from Douglas Adams' books about, what's the first one? Anyway, it ends up with Life, the Universe, and Everything, and Restaurant at the End of the Universe. That series, they have a little mechanical fish that they put in your ear, and it is your translator, which is why everybody can understand each other's languages. That's way too much like Wrath of Khan for me. So, but that's the modern cultural usage of this story of Babel, all these languages. And at the time that they start to build the tower, they all have one language. Now, we do not have any writing this early that has been found in the Holy Lands. You'll find a little bit in the, maybe as far back as 1500, but it really isn't until about 1000 BC that we start getting written documents in Israel. There are countries around it, right, in Iraq, Iran, the Hittites, etc., that will have written documents from this time period. But we don't know anything about what the one united language was. There is no written or scientific evidence to teach you anything about that first primal language. So if somebody tells you they know, it would need to be revelation. Now, Elder Faust says Portuguese is the Adamic language, but he just served his mission in Brazil, so we understand where that's coming from. Since it's a Romance languages, it's post-Romance, right? So the Tower of Babel is really what we today would call a ziggurat. And in the city, in Babylon, in that area, which is Iraq and Iran today, they built a great number of these artificial mountains. They are similar to the pyramids in Egypt, except there's nothing inside. There are no rooms inside. This is an artificial mountain made out of debris and earthen bricks that are unfired, and then covered with a fired brick exterior. So they are now, whoops, let's see. Okay, this is a reconstruction of what they think the city of Ur looked like. We'll hear about Ur because that's where Abram is from. But it shows you a ziggurat in its location in a city. And the whole point is the outside of it and stairs up, and there's a temple on the top. Sometimes they would have gardens on the different levels. And those are the infamous hanging gardens of Babylon. Very much like the top of our conference center, where we have an entire forest of trees on the top of the conference center. That's what they were doing with these ziggurats. So there's some symbolism going on here. The idea was that after the flood, people got together and said, hey, if there's going to be another flood, we need to be up higher than the flood was. So they built these towers in order to get above the flood, take away God's power to kill them, and find a way to enter heaven without God's help. And so that ends up hooking into a theme from videos 5, 6, and 7 of 2022, where I talk about the parable, a man had two sons. And that really starts with, well, in the pre-existence. But in the Bible, it starts with the story of Cain and Abel. And then it will follow the descendants of Cain and his other brother, Seth, whose name means replacement. So he's in Abel's place. And follow their descendants down. Each of them have sons or descendants named Enoch. Both of those Enochs build cities. So there's two cities of Enoch. There's two Lamechs. There's Methuselah and Methusael. Go back and watch the videos and you'll see that these families parallel each other, but are very different as well. The building of cities is not necessarily a good thing in the biblical text. The good thing to do is to be a shepherd and not get everybody together and have places where you're going to fight wars. So we have two cities, and in those two cities, you want to think of the city of Enoch and the city of Enoch. And don't get them confused. I've seen major biblical scholars mess that up, thinking that the city of Enoch that we all know as Zion is built by Cain's grandson Enoch. Don't make that mistake. But in those cities, there are two important buildings. Both are mountains of their Lord, and it has their Lord's house. The question is, which God are you worshiping? But the gods live on the tops of mountains. If you think about it, that's all the way down into about 600 in Greece, talking about the Greek gods. And then the Romans pick it up from there with the gods living on the top of Mount Olympus. So this idea that God lives on a mountaintop, and if you don't have a convenient mountaintop, you build one in flat places. Okay? The question is, what are you going to build out of? And the Tower of Babel is built out of bricks. And as you probably are aware, bricks are made out of clay or dirt. But remember, people are made out of clay or dirt, right? Adam is made out of Adamah. So I believe that the text is saying that this religion, this building, has its foundation in men and humans, rather than a foundation and a building made out of stone. And that's what the temple, Solomon's temple, will be built of stone. All the altars that you're going to see Abram building in each city he goes to are made out of stone. Stone is what God's people use. Now, a lot of our temples are now reinforced concrete and steel, but they have a facing of stone so that they will look like they're built of stone, except, of course, wonderful Salt Lake Temple, which that's really stone. And so you want to think about the symbolism of the choices here and what it is that you put your trust in. You put your trust in the arm of flesh or in the arm of the Lord. And that starts this early in the storyline. So it says that Abram is from Ur. And this is a reconstruction of what Ur in southern Iraq looks like, as they've rebuilt some of it, and some of it is artificial intelligence, of course. The question is, which Ur is Abram from? And you'll notice on this map that I have marked two Urs, one down in Samaria, which becomes Babylon. The Assyrians are way up north. The Persians will take the whole thing over. So to draw lines between those nations is fallacious because they all didn't exist at the same time. Okay? But the centers of those nations, where they will later exist, are depicted in those dark red letters. But the center of this whole civilization of this area is Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. And those rivers are the Tigris and Euphrates, which are absolutely essential to be used in irrigation in order to have fertile land. As you're well aware, living in Utah, you have to irrigate, right? If there's any water to use. Yeah. So, the discussion is about whether you're at Ur, down by where the Sumerians are, that's way down south near the Persian Gulf, or the Arabian Gulf, depending on which people are talking about it? Or is it way up north of Syria, up in what might now be called Turkey? And here's why there's confusion. Ur is the Semitic word for city. It's also the word for light. You've heard it, the plural, Urim, is Urim and Thummim, lights and perfections. So, the place that you would see light when you're out in the deserts of the Middle East is at a city. And all these cities will end up either being built on top of hills or will build hills inside of the city for worship. Each time the city gets destroyed, they level the rubble out and build again on top of it, because it's in a strategic location near water, and they want to reuse that later. And so as the centuries go by, the cities get higher and higher. So think about when Jesus says, a city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do you put your light, it says candlestick, but that's menorah, but that means a thing that holds light. Man, or, it's a thing holding light, under a bushel. Instead, the place that is lit, that you can see from miles away, is a city. So which city is Abram from? We don't know. So you get to guess. Okay. Last year, we talked about the 10 trials of Abraham. And one of the trials that he went through was being born in a family where his father and his relatives worshipped a pantheon of different gods. And so we have these stories of Abram going in and breaking all the idols and putting in the local temple, and putting the stick that he used to break all of those clay idols in the hands of the biggest idol. And he tells his dad, I didn't do it, he did. And his dad says, you know very well that he can't move. And he says, so why are you worshiping him then? If it's just a chunk of clay, why do you worship idols? And so Abram becomes, in the minds of all of his descendants, all the Abrahamic peoples, the first great monotheist. Now, this is lesson 8 in the other set of videos. And you've been studying in Come Follow Me all kinds of people who believe in the one true God, who lived before Abram. But most people in the rest of the world don't believe that. They don't believe that Adam worshiped Jehovah. They don't believe that Enoch worshiped Jehovah, or Noah. Okay? And I remember when I first learned that, I was like, what? I mean, I was raised on Hugh Nibley, right? Who talks about how the truth was given from the beginning and dispersed out into the whole world. Okay. It's good to know what other people believe so that when you're reading their books, you know where they're coming from and what their language is saying based on their theology. That's important to know. So as this first great monotheist, he follows his father from Ur to a place called Haran, which happens to be right up there near the Ur in the north. And that's why many scholars will say, I think it's this Ur up in the north, because that's pretty close to Haran, where Abram and his family will move. After his father's death, he takes on responsibility, and his brother Nahor has died. he takes on the responsibility for Nahor's son named Lot. And he marries the daughter of one of his brothers, which is Sarai. And then God calls him to move. And he says, I will make of thee, this is in Genesis chapter 12. And he says four important statements about Abram and his descendants. He said, I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. In thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Now, I remember reading that in Hebrew and thinking, that's really an ambiguous statement, that fourth statement. Is it a prophecy that in you and your descendants, all the nations of the world will be blessed by the Abrahamic peoples? Or is it a commandment? Go out and bless people. You see the difference?
Wow.
And that's how the Bible works, is it's kind of ambiguous. And I personally think that it's ambiguous for a reason. So that at some point in your life, the Spirit will say to you, don't just sit back and wait for blessings. You are supposed to be a blessing to others. Get out there and do some service. Right? But each person is at a different place and a different level. And I've noticed a tendency in our prayers, our institutional prayers, to thank God for all our great blessings, but not say anything about what we're supposed to do with those blessings. And this statement, if it is a command, kind of calls us to be better at that. So, he wants Abram to go into the land which he will show him. And so you can see where the second Ur is, way up there at the top, and how Haran is just west of it. And after many of the family members have died in Haran, and notice the area that they were in is Padam Aram. That is where Eleazar is going to go back and get a wife for Isaac. Her name is Rebekah. That is where Jacob is going to go to get a wife from Laban, Rebekah's brother. This is where all the relatives live, is up near Haran. And so evidence is that they are not necessarily converts to the one true God, but they're close relatives, so they're better to marry than anybody else. So that's where they're going to go. And this is the point at which I personally feel it's important for you to get acquainted with the map. Because what Abram is going to do as he goes through the Holy Land is stop and build altars at the cities, they aren't cities yet, at the places that will become important cities in the lives of his descendants, in the lives of the nations of Israel and Judah, in the life of Jesus. And if you don't recognize what happened there first and how it has been used, that town, you're missing some of the important background as to what Jesus is choosing to teach there. And so pay attention to where things happen in the Holy Land. I will try to send you out a halfway decent map that you could print out and mark up. So as Abram leaves Haran, verse 5 of chapter 12 is a really interesting one to me. It says, Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all the substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran. And they went into Canaan. What does it mean, the souls they had gotten in Haran? And that's an idea that the Jewish rabbis will come back to over and over again, talking about Abram and Sarai as missionaries who are preaching about the one true God, that they have converted other people in Haran, and when they move to the Holy Land, those people move with them. And we'll see evidence for this a little bit later in the story. So the first place that it says that Abram goes, he passes through the place of Sichem in the plain of Moreh. Now, you got a problem here, because Sichem, Sychar, is up in the northern kingdom of Israel. And the place we traditionally call the plains of Moreh is way down south of Jerusalem. It helps to know that the plains is a terrible translation. It's actually by the oak tree, or terebinth tree. Now, I understand why the King James translators wanted to move holy trees out of the Old Testament, because the history of the British Isles had a lot of people, the Druids, who worshiped trees. And they didn't want to suggest that Abram was worshiping a tree. Nevertheless, through the entire Old Testament, people are going to stop at places where there is an important tree that is named. Trees were rare. Okay? And it was about 10 years ago that there was a terrible fire in the north of Israel, in a forest that they had meticulously planted trees up near Mount Carmel, which is the most fertile valley in Israel. And they had planted hundreds of thousands of trees, and then a forest fire broke out. And many of the firefighters were killed in fighting that terrible fire. Having trees can be a blessing or it can be a problem if you live in a dry place, as you know. Most arborists are telling us right now, get outside and water your trees, or you may lose them, because the trees are used to getting some moisture in the winter. So if you have fruit trees, if you have trees that you want to keep, they're recommending get out and water your trees, each one of them. And you might be hand watering because you don't want the pipes to burst, right? That's what you need to do if you want to have trees. So in the town of Sichem, or Shechem, or Sychar, depending on when in the story they're talking about this city, which is built between two mountains. There's a hill on one side called Mount Ebal. There is a hill on the other side called Mount Gerizim. And this is where Jacob will have his home, and where Jacob's well is located. This is where Joseph's tomb is. This is an important city in the rest of the story. But there's a big tree there. And there, Abram built an altar and worshiped God. Now, the fact that he's building an altar indicates that at some point, he got some priesthood. Because through the entire biblical text, the only people who are allowed to build altars and offer sacrifices have to have been ordained to priesthood. We don't have a lot of evidence for Abram yet. He will then continue south through the Holy Land to a place called Hebron. And Hebron is down north of Beersheba, halfway between Beersheba and Jerusalem. And this will be where he buys land to bury his wife Sarah when she dies. And where each of the patriarchs and matriarchs are buried, 6 of them. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah. Why not Rachel? She died somewhere else, and you have to be buried within a day. And so Rachel's tomb is up near Bethlehem. But this is the tomb of the patriarchs where Abram bought land, the only land he owned. He is a stranger in a strange land through most of this, through his entire life, until he has bought land to be buried in. Only land he'll own is his grave. So there you can see, they were way up north. They came down through Shechem. They're coming down halfway between Salem and Beersheba is where Hebron is. And then they continue south all the way to Egypt because there's a drought. And unless you are living next to a big river that has its headwaters in mountains, like the Nile and the Tigris and Euphrates, other smaller rivers just dry up and disappear. And so you will go to one of those river valleys in a time of drought. And we'll see this happen over and over in the Old Testament of people going to Egypt. So Abram and Sarah go to Egypt, and then when they leave Egypt, they come back and will settle in the town of Beersheba. Now, it isn't named that until later. Beer means well, and Sheva means 7. Shabbat, finished, complete, or oath. And so Abram, when he comes back, he digs a well in Beersheba, and he makes a covenant with the local people that they will let him use the water. Because issues of water rights have been huge in the history of the world. And whether or not you have the right to that water in that well will determine whether you survive or not. Randy, would you flip the heat back on? It's kind of cooled off in here. At least feels like it to me. It's at Beersheba that Abram realizes he and Lot have too many animals, too many people to be able to all stay in the same place. So he offers Lot the option of going north into Canaan or going east over into the fertile plains that are now covered in salt marshes that are at the southern end of the Dead Sea. Apparently, the Dead Sea has gotten much bigger since the time Abram and Lot lived there. And you know from your life experience that the Great Salt Lake has gotten huge. When Bangader was the governor, and the streams were running right down State Street, right? They had to build sandbag and make a river out of State Street. And now our concern is the lake is disappearing and leaves behind all of the salt marshes. And that's the point that the Dead Sea is at now, but it didn't used to be that way. It used to be a fertile green plain, and many people lived in the area. archaeologists believe that underneath parts of the Dead Sea, we will probably find ruins of ancient cities inhabited by people who once lived there. And that's where Lot chooses to go, is east, and he will settle over towards Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay? That is pretty much a bad idea, because the surrounding cities are so wealthy that other kings are jealous. And you'll have a consortium of 5 kings that will choose to get together to fight and take over all the lands and all the goods and all the people in those cities that are south and east of the Dead Sea. And all of this is in chapter 13 of Genesis. And then we get to 14, where we have the kings getting together to fight a battle. In the attack, they conquer, and they take Lot and his family captive. And they head back to their homes, which apparently is way up near Damascus and up into Syria, what is now Syria. Now, that distance is only 150 miles. The nation of Israel is only 125 miles long. The entire nation, the entire country. So you'll see people traveling from one end to the other of the country rather quickly because it's tiny. But we know that Abram is going to head north with his men, and they come through the place called Dan. Do you see Dan up there? Now that's anachronistic, because Dan is one of Abram's grandsons who hasn't been born yet, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Notice that whoever is editing the text is referring to cities by their current names, not by the names they had at the time these events occurred. Okay? That's helpful to realize why there's anachronistic things going on. Randy and I have been to Dan. This is one of the few remains from the time of Abram. This is Tel Dan. And Tel means an artificial mountain made by the destruction of one city after another over hundreds of years, and they rebuild on the top of it. And you'll see very important archaeological digs at these tells. You've heard of some of these tells. One is Tel Jericho. Another is Tel Megiddo, or Har, mountain Megiddo, or Armageddon. Okay? Certain locations are worth rebuilding at, and Dan is one of those. But most of this structure that's here, this is the gate of the city, most of the structure is built with unbaked clay bricks. And the fact that they're still around after 2,000 years, or 4,000 years now, is a miracle. They might be faced with some baked bricks, but this is why cities disappear, because they're made out of adobe, essentially. And that's going to fall apart over time. But that's one of the few places that we have. Now, what's fascinating is when you read about Abram going up to Dan, he does not go alone. This is in Genesis chapter 14, verse 14. And it says, when Abram heard that his brother, that means Lot, who is really his nephew, but relationships are, if you're a blood relative, you're a brother. And Randy and I found out that because we were important in someone's life, I was actually present at their daughter's birth, We became uncle and auntie, even though they were Sikhs from the north of India and we have no blood relation. But we're auntie anyway. I mean, I'm auntie. That's kind of how the language is through the Old Testament. And so don't get confused when it calls Lot his brother. He's not his brother. He's a close relative. Okay? Lot's taken captive. And so he armed Abram's trained, and the next word is servants, which is in italics. That means that word does not exist in the Hebrew. I always thought that italics were to emphasize something important, which is how we use it in English. But in the King James, it's to indicate this is our best guess of what they might have meant, but the word doesn't exist. So it essentially says he armed his trained, and that means people, right? That were born in his house, 318 of them, and pursued those 5 kings up to Dan. Now, wait a minute. If Abram has 318 army men among the people living in his household, how many people are there? If each of those men has a wife, and each of them has a couple of kids, and they have some living parents, a really conservative estimate is at least 2,000. So when you picture Abram and Sarai, almost always the paintings are of Abram and Sarah, 2 old people living in one tent and nobody else. The reality is, Abram is like a stake president, hauling his entire stake with him everywhere he goes. All 2,000 of them, which is the estimate of about how big a stake is. So you want to change how you think about Abram. He is a really important leader of a huge tribe and is a threat when he moves into someone's country. Okay? Thanks, Randy. So, as they come from the battle, they win the battle. They get Lot back. They also get all of the people of those cities of the plain, and the kings who didn't go to battle, who waited, oh well, we lost everything. They're delighted to meet Abram and offer to pay him for their people back. Just give us our people back. Now, this is clearly AI. I don't know what it is about AI that it all looks the same, but they probably do not have any horses. Horses are extremely expensive war machines, and that's all they were used for in the ancient world, was to go to war. Now, yes, Abram's going to war, but since he doesn't own any of the land, I doubt that he is herding big whole bunches of horses around. And we don't know of camels being introduced into this area until around the time of Abraham. It's possible that he had camels, but they actually come from other parts of the world. So, be careful with AI. It's often wrong. You know that now, right? You always have. So, Abram then stops. Oh, I needed to mention. As we think of Abram and Sarah, we're going to have later conversation about Isaac taking Rebekah into Sarah's tent. Sarah's tent acquires a really interesting meaning within Rabbinic Judaism. Sarah's tent is where the women in this household of thousands of people went to talk and study. Now the rabbis will say that they're studying Torah in Sarah's tent. Little problem, the Torah hasn't been written and won't be for another 1,000 years. But you have to kind of let go of chronology in the stories of the rabbis and in some of the Bible, okay? Just, it's not meant as a literal history, but there was no history. The first people to really write a documentary history are the Greeks, Herodotus, and that's like 600 BC. So this is way earlier than that. The only things we have to go on are the statements carved into stone or into clay that then gets baked in cuneiform, right, on tablets, telling about the conquests of the kings. And how accurate are people's statements about how many wars they've won? Right? You gotta take it all with a grain of salt and see what sources you can find that are better. So there's Sarah's tent. So after coming, they come back to another plains of Mamre. Now, scholars are going to put this oak tree somewhere else, halfway between Beersheba and Hebron. So you have to stop and say, what does that mean? Now, what does Moreh mean? We're also going to see the same word used to describe where Abram is going to offer, well, Abraham at the time is going to offer Isaac on Mount Moriah. You're going to hear Hagar use the same term when she talks about a well where she saw God, which is yareh. Yareh is the verb to see. So Moreh means somewhere you saw God. That would suggest that Abram is having visions as he travels through the land and builds altars at different locations. And this will be an important stop on the road. As he's heading there, though, he goes through the town of Salem. You knew we'd get to Salem somehow. This is our town's big show, is this moment in chapter 14, where Abram arrives with all this stuff from the conquering way up north, and he stops to pay tithes to Melchizedek. And let me just go down one more. Melchizedek is actually the first word that I ever read in Hebrew. I think I told you about that. That it means Melech, spelled from the right to the left. It's Meleki, which is my king. That's the possessive, the Y, the Yud. Malaki Tzedek. Melech is king. Tzedek is righteous. It's also translated in the story of Noah as just. It becomes the name Zadok in the time of Solomon, name of the priest who takes over the temple at the time of Solomon. And his descendants, the Zadokites, and there's a whole opera written about Zadok, but the Zadokites, when it gets into Greek of the New Testament, that name changes again and it becomes Sadducee. So technically, the Sadducees are claiming to be the righteous ones who run the temple. And this word is associated with the temple because only righteous people are supposed to be going there, right? Now, Melech has a number of meanings. One is king. If you hear the word malak, that's a messenger of the king. It gets translated as angel. If it's malka with the feminine ending, it's queen or kingdom. They're both the same word, because a king gets a kingdom by having a malka, a wife, who has children who will inherit the kingdom. All these are the same word. But melech also means what? A worker. And that's an important way to look at a king that you'll see in the book of Deuteronomy, of what is it the king should be doing. Should he take your sons and daughters as his servants and slaves and tax you heavily? Or should he be out planting his own crops? Now, as we continue this lesson, we'll see what the very first king of Israel, that Saul, how he's living. And you want to go to the Book of Mormon and compare two kings there, King Benjamin and King Noah. And which one is a righteous king or a worker of righteousness, and which one is not? A major theme throughout the biblical text and into our other books of Scripture. We seldom take the time to sit back and say, so if you are ordained to the Melchizedek priesthood, and that would include anyone who's been endowed at the temple, right? You are expected to not just sit back on your laurels and say, I will be a king and a priest forever, like Melchizedek. Instead, it's, I'm going to be working my tail off forever, which is more likely in the church today, that you'll be called and asked to serve even when you're 80 years old. That's just how it goes. Okay, so Melchizedek blesses Abram and offers him bread and wine. Now, Christians, of course, will see this as a prefiguring of the sacrament. It is also what any host would give his guest. If you give them meat as well, it's really a big deal, and we'll see Abram doing that. But the fact that Abram is paying tithes to Melchizedek implies that there is a kind of hierarchical understanding between these men, and that this is not the first time they've met, and that Melchizedek may be his priesthood leader. So if Abram is like a stake president, what does that make Melchizedek? That's like in the area presidency or a 70 or an apostle in our language today. Maybe even president of the church. I don't know. But those are current terminologies that you're not going to find in the Old Testament. So I have two questions here. Yes, Brother Weiss?
Do we know anything about the lineage of Melchizedek?
Well, we know he has a priesthood. This is from the book of Hebrews. We know he has a priesthood which is without father and mother. And so some people have said Melchizedek is without father or mother, which is absurd. What it means is it's not the Aaronic priesthood, where you have to be of the lineage in the tribe of Levi and a descendant of Aaron in order to be Kohanim. And it would be impossible for Melchizedek to be a member of that priesthood because Aaron hasn't been born yet. Levi hasn't been born yet. So this priesthood, which we call the higher priesthood, is actually the first one that's been around like forever. Now, both Joseph Smith and the articles in the Times and Seasons and Jewish rabbis, and I agree with them, that Melchizedek is a title and that his personal name was Shem, the son of Noah. And if you go back, which some of us who have OCD have to do, and you make a graph with the genealogy of each of the patriarchs from Adam on down, you can see who's alive at the same time. And you'll notice that everybody before Noah, they all die or are taken up in the city of Enoch. All of the great patriarchs die just before the flood. Some lived to, like Methuselah, lived to be 937 or whatever it is. Others are only in their 600s, really young guys. But everybody dies just before the flood. But Shem is going to live for hundreds of years after the flood. Noah lives after the flood, right? And Shem will live until just before the time of the 12 sons of Jacob. He knows Abraham, he knows Isaac, he knows Jacob. And that was a surprise to me. But what you can find out if you tape together several sheets of graph paper and plot out the numbers, or now you could use Excel. But if you want to know what it's saying, write it down and see what it says when you look at it. Okay? And so Melchizedek may be Shem. And they're living in the area that Shem is given responsibility for. Okay? Okay, there's Melchizedek. They are worshiping El Elyon, which is the name, the Most High God. Now, I don't know that we stop and think about this, but how you interpret the Most High God depends on what your theology is. Everyone else in biblical studies will say, see, they're really polytheists at heart. This is the God who was higher than Baal. This is the God who was higher than the gods of the Egyptians. This is the Most High God. Mormons, on the other hand, will say, in our structure of gods, right, husbands, wives, kids, the whole bit, this is the Most High that we know of. And that would be Elohim, right? Okay. Now that brings us to the covenant.
Now you
Yes.
said you had another question
Oh, yeah.
for him.
Dennis, did you have
You answered it.
It was the same. I thought it might be the same question. Thank you. Okay. So this is where we get into an interesting discussion of covenant. If you had watched the other videos, you would have been introduced to the idea of covenant, a word that is first used in the story of Noah, where Noah and his sons and their wives are put under covenant. And so that's where the language begins in our text. And so the first mention of covenant is to Noah in chapter 6, verse 18. But with you will I establish my covenant, and you shall come into the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. So the very first mention of covenant is made in the context of husbands and wives. Not just to men alone. It's given to husbands and wives. The next mention, or one of the next mentions, is in chapter 9, verse 9, where it says, I will establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you, which means this is a perpetual covenant going from father to son, from mother to daughter. Families are in the covenant. The next mention is that there are tokens and signs associated with the covenant. For example, in Genesis 9, verses 11, 12, and 13, the token of the covenant is that God will place his bow in the clouds. Now, it's not a rainbow. Everybody has seen that as a rainbow. And metaphorically it is. But what God actually is saying is, I will hang up my weapon of war that I just used to kill you all, which came from the clouds. It was rain. And lightning will be seen as the arrows shot from his bow. And rain has two sides to it. It can be great in California and Utah, or it can be a disaster where my son lived in Asheville, North Carolina. Right? So which side of that are you on? Are you on the blessing side of the token or the punishment or disaster side of the covenant? In verse 15, God says that when he looks upon the bow, he will remember the covenant. So both God and the people making covenants with him are expected to remember and to look at things and remember. That's what some of the tokens are given for. And then verse 16, the bow will be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between myself and every living creature that is upon the face of the earth. The everlasting covenant is not something new. It's extremely old. There's only ever been one covenant. We'll talk about different parts of it, but in God's terminology, there's only one covenant between him and us. And everything else is commentary. But the everlasting covenant, the Brit Olam, is here introduced as between not only humans, but every living creature on the face of the earth. So you might ask yourself, how am I treating all these other people, all these animals who are a part of this covenant? And
is it also trees?
It's every living creature which has the breath of life.
Breath of life. Okay.
And so it doesn't include fish, by the way, because they don't have breath. It would be dolphins.
Okay. Thank
So you want dolphin-free tuna, right? Okay. So Genesis 15. This is the chapter in which Abram, having saved Lot, having paid his tithes to Melchizedek, then essentially says to God, who comes to him in a vision in verse 1, and God says, well, the Lord, so that's Jehovah, says to Abram, fear not, I am your shield and your reward. I will reward you. You don't need the stuff from all the kings. I am your shield, your magen. A shield in battle is your magen. And you've heard of Magen David, if you're old enough. There's Magen David wine. And it has the Magen David on it, which is the Star of David, which is the heraldic emblem of David. The six-pointed star. And Abram says, okay, Jehovah, Lord God, and this is my Lord and Master Elohim, what are you going to give me as some kind of surety on this covenant we've made? Seeing that I am still childless, you promised I would have an entire nation of people, and I have not had a single child. Will Eleazar, whom I have adopted, as he's my right-hand man, and it's Eleazar that he's going to send up to Haran to get a wife for Isaac. Okay, we'll see Eleazar again. Is he going to be my heir? Is that who you mean? And then then the word of the Lord came to him saying, this shall not be thine heir. So this is where we get to men cutting covenant. That's the verb that's used. And this is where the word of the Lord came and said, this shall not be thine heir, but one coming out of your own bowels. We've talked about bowels. It's not intestines, right? Shall be thine own heir. And he brought him forth abroad and said, now, count the stars. Tell and count are the same word in Hebrew. So if you have read, it starts with a Y. Count the stars.
Number of the stars?
It's a woman author talking about the Holocaust.
Oh.
Anyway, great story. Count the stars.
Number of the stars.
Number the stars. Maybe that was
Yeah,
it.
I think it is Lois Lowry.
Lowry.
Yeah,
You're right.
okay.
Lois Lowry. Number
Yeah.
the stars. That's where she gets this from. Number the stars. So shall your seed be. And Abram believed the Lord. Now the word believed can also be translated as was faithful to. It is not necessarily a mental belief. It's an emotional commitment of being faithful to someone. And so in the book of Hebrews, when it's listing all the people who had faith, Abram is the one who has the most faith, because at 100 years of age, he still thinks he's going to have kids. I remember when my aunt was dying, she had never married. And as she's lying in bed dying, she was telling me about her wedding that she was planning, because someone she had been in love with had fallen from a ladder and died 70 years earlier. And he had come to her in a dream, and as soon as she got to heaven, they were going to get married. The gospel gives you a lot of hope that other people don't have that same kind of hope. It's a wonderful thing. So this is where it comes from. And God counted it unto him for righteousness, his faithfulness to God. And then he says, okay, let's do the ceremony. And this is the ceremony that was used between any two men, and the only women I have found in the Old Testament who use this language are not Israelites or Hebrews. It's foreigners. But this is the language in the ceremony used through all of the Middle East to make some kind of covenant or treaty or contract. And so Jehovah says, I am the Lord that brought you out of Ur of Chaldees to give you this land. Now you'll notice what he's giving him is land and seed. Now is that children or is that food for his crops? Well, yes. Okay, it's a broad meaning of seed. And he said to him, I will give you this land to inherit it. And Abram says, Lord God, whereby shall I know? Give me something concrete. And Jehovah says, okay, take a heifer, 3 years old, and a she-goat, 3 years old, and a ram, 3 years old, and a turtle dove and a young pigeon. Now, some people will define this as 3 heifers, 3 goats, she-goats, and 3 rams, because it just says 3 and then the animal. You don't know. This is the less blood version, with just 3 major land animals. And notice that 2 of them are female. And he took each of these, Abram did, and slit their throats from ear to ear, and divided them in the midst between joint and marrow. He hacks their carcasses apart like you would see a carcass hanging in a meat packing plant. And he laid these on the ground, one piece opposite the other. The birds he divided not, he just wrung their necks. So this is a picture of what it might have looked like had he been on some uneven ground, to have the blood run downhill. So Abram hacks these large animals up, and as you can imagine, if you have ever been where large land animals are being killed, we're talking gallons of blood that's on the ground. And there they lay until, and by the way, all of the animals in this story will later be considered clean animals acceptable for sacrifice at the later tabernacle and temple. Of course, we already have seen Adam and Enoch and Noah and Abram offering sacrifices on altars. So there's already some idea of what are acceptable animals and what are not. But these are the animals that will later be included in the law of Moses. At this point, the idea is that both of the covenanting parties will walk between the pieces, getting blood on themselves. This is what is called in the Book of Mormon a blood oath. And this you've seen in gangster movies and mafia movies where they're swearing blood oaths, right? Do this or I'll kill you. This, hack me up, divided between joint and marrow, my carcass will lay on the ground. This is what you can do to me if I don't keep my covenant with you. And let me go ahead and finish. We'll come back to that other stuff next week. So, because of the custom of walking between those pieces, and you say to each other, this is what you can do if I don't keep my promise to you. You'd expect them to walk between the pieces, and I have two stories where we see this in the Old Testament. But that doesn't happen. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp passed between the pieces. Not Abram. He never walks. And in that day, Jehovah made, it says, but the Hebrew is karat, cut, a covenant with Abram, saying, unto your seed have I given this land. So you have to ask yourself, what is the symbolism here? What does it mean to have a smoking furnace and a burning lamp passing? And you can almost see something like an incense burner for the smoke and a torch or a menorah for the lamp. What do those represent? How are they later used in the story of the house of Israel? That's what passes between the pieces, this torch and incense burner. Well, during the Exodus, all 40 years, in the daytime, there was a cloud above the tabernacle. Now, every day they are offering offerings on the altar. And so the cloud may have been a rain cloud, but it also may have been the smoke rising from the burning of the sacrifice on the altar in the courtyard. It may have been the smoke rising from the burning of the incense right in front of the veil where they burn incense every day, and that smoke rises. And every night there was a pillar of fire, perhaps the fire from the altar of sacrifice, perhaps the fire on the menorah. You may be interested to know that at the time of Jesus, they made 4 huge menorot that stood 20 feet high. Each took about a gallon of oil in each of the holders, the 7 holders, and the wicks were made out of the priest's old worn out clothing, and they used them as street lighting to help the pilgrims come to the temple at night. So you had these flames of these huge menorot. But I hope that you can see that that smoke and fire through the whole Exodus story represented that Jehovah was in his temple. Those are his symbols. We'll find the symbol of the cloud used for Jehovah all through the Old Testament. And he is the light of the world, right? So, symbolically, Jehovah is the only one to pass between the pieces. And he walks twice. The first time that he goes between the pieces, he says, in effect, this is what you can do to me. You can cut me off. You can kill me. I will no longer be a God to you if I don't keep my promise. And then he walks a second time and says, and if you don't keep your promises, you can cut me off, and I will die in your place. I will be the carcass on the ground. For me, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ in the story of Abraham. We refer to the gospel of Abraham. Well, what is the good news? It's that we have a covenant with Jesus, that when we fail, he takes care of it. Mercy is available. Our sins can be forgiven, and he dies in our place. And I leave that with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.